So this was an excerpt I happen to have. Forgot who sent this to me, but from Arms and the Man magazine, 1919, talking about the history of universal military training, which is a topic that has definitely come up to me in the past. But the interesting things about this one is it goes back into the colonies, talking about how in Virginia and Maryland, and back to the 1600s, every Virginia colonist was trained in military tactics, period. And that's just the way it was. And the next page does talk about New Hampshire colony, 1673, point to take charge. So there's a history here. And then going back into, this was written in after World War I, but after World War II, there was this resurgence of universal military training, which Eisenhower dropped in favor of new look and nuclear policy, not the theme of the day. But I don't know, what's your take? Like, what's the history look like for this?
No, I think you're hitting the nail on the head, and I appreciate you going that direction. Most people don't want, when they talk about the American militia tradition, they want to go back into the dark chapter, and it does have multiple dark chapters, let's be clear, but they all want to go back to the dark chapters of the late 1960s all the way through the mid 1990s. That was a very dark time for America militia. I think right now it's been a resurgence. I think it's for many reasons. We could wax poetic for a while on why is it being more accepted at this time and accepted across a broader spectrum of political spectrum. But nonetheless, it goes way back. People forget American Rangers, U.S. Army Rangers, run their tradition. I think back to the 1640s with Rogers Rangers. I believe that's when it started, or somebody started in the 1640s. And we can get into what ranging is too. But anyway, it starts in the 1640s, and it doesn't become part of the United States Army until it's revived through British SAS training in the 1940s. Let me say it again, 1640s to the 1940s. For those of you bad at math, that's 3 centuries Rangers have served as militia. And less than 1 century, a scant 80 years, that it has served in the federal army. So we have proud traditions in the American militia that go way back into the day, and arguably a rose by any other name is still a rose. If you buy into that adage, then you have to admit that there have been no American conflicts, or you'll be hard pressed to find them, that do not involve American militia. All the way up to present day operations, we've had U.S. militiamen and U.S. volunteers fighting in every American conflict. Wake Island in World War II, 2/3 of the defenders, I believe it was 2/3, maybe it was 1/3. I think it was 2/3 of the defenders were contractors, 1/3 were Marines.
Big M militia has a stigma attached to it now, but to me, it's always been thinking about when Katrina hit back in New Orleans, and it's the neighbors who get together to fill sandbags, and do something for the community. Like, everybody has the vision of, they're gonna wear the ragtag bunch of camo and whatever hunting rifles they had on, and yeah, that exists. But to me, it's more about that local group of your community who's just saying, all right, we got to take care of ourselves here. So let's get together, whatever that means, and that can go up to defense.
So two thoughts I have on that. First is that I've had the pleasure of working with the Missouri Militia, which is a state chartered militia, nonprofit. Good guys, very progressive. And when I say progressive here, I mean very inclusive of the demographic that they represent, right? And again, they've worked with, law enforcement agencies. They've even, collaborated with the lieutenant governor. So they are legitimately a chartered militia, and it's still a private. It's not a public. Missouri is looking at standing up a state guard, which is like a hybrid of private militia, but not quite. It's actually state financed, but they haven't done this yet. So anyway, Missouri militia right now chartered. They were the first. That's not true. They were second with boots on the ground in the Joplin tornado F5 that leveled the city about 10 years ago in southern Missouri, if you recall, just leveled that city. FEMA showed up with no leadership, no equipment, no food, no water for their own people. So two Deuce and Ash carrying a platoon of the Missouri militia pull in about half a day later, get out, set up their tents and their operations center complete with a mess section and water and food to feed their platoon, and then jumped right back on the deuces with chainsaws and started going to work. When Colonel Sumter, the lady with FEMA that was in charge, she just latched onto him. And I want to say it was like 3 or 4 days that the Missouri militia ran FEMA, because FEMA couldn't even give themselves water. And so they took all the FEMA volunteers, put them on trucks, got them out there, and just ran FEMA operations for 3 or 4 days until FEMA leadership finally showed up with logistics. So there's a fantastic story about the reality of the American militia. They're far more likely to respond to a natural disaster than a man-made disaster, i.e., armed conflict. That said, they came armed, because you always have looters, or you don't always, hopefully you never have looters, but it's always a threat, right? So you have that and all sorts of other things. So the more recent one that I want to show, and I would like to highlight, as we learn more about what happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and when we say that, everybody thinks Rittenhouse. Well, Rittenhouse is a viable discussion, a topic for discussion, but I mean beyond that, broader than that. You had people coming together to save properties from being burned, to clean up properties after they were vandalized, to try and resist a riot, criminals. And so you can put Rittenhouse to the side for a minute. Again, it's worthy of discussion, but forget him for a second. Let's talk about everybody else that came together and defended that city and cleaned up that city. And what else do you call them but a militia?
Exactly. So